But you've got kids in your building for, 10, 11, 12 hours a day. Whether you like it or not, you are in the moral formation business. You are shaping character. You are shaping virtue. When institutions start to promote the ideas of the day, that can become very harmful, especially kids, where there are few other sources of that kind of generational wisdom that's so important. When we were hiring teachers, there were two primary criteria. First was subject matter knowledge, and then pedagogical capacity. It was accelerated since George Floyd. There's been a third leg, and that is this ideological alignment of what the role of a teacher is.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm DavidBernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, welcome to this edition of The Contrarian podcast. I'm your host, DavidBernstein, CEO of the North American Values Institute, and I'm very honored to have Rowe with us today. Ian is the CEO and co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies. And he is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And he is the author of an amazing new book that is so amazing that we had our entire staff read and had a session with Ian at a recent staff retreat called Agency, the 4-point plan for all children to overcome the victimhood narrative and discover their pathway to power. Just such a powerful title in and of itself and really lives up to its billing. So Ian, it's really lovely to have you on. Really appreciate the time.
Well, David, given how much I respect your work, this is a great honor for me to be with you. So thank you very much. And I was very excited when you mentioned that your staff did read Agency. It was a wonderful discussion.
Before we get into the book and all the insights you bring, I want to just talk a little bit about what you do. You have these charter schools. Tell us a little bit about them and what your role is and how they're doing.
In terms of what I do, it is hopefully distinguishing about my work that I am an author. I do work at a think tank at the American Enterprise Institute. But what I try to do is bring ideas into reality. So often there's a disconnect between those people who have theories about how different ideas or policies should work for populations that might be disadvantaged. There's a disconnect between the theory and the practice, and often the two either don't intersect, or when they do, there are unintended consequences that weren't really thought about. As a researcher and policymaker, and I run schools in the very communities that many of us are concerned about. So for the last 15 years, I've founded and led public charter schools in some pretty tough communities in the Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. For 10 years, I ran a network of elementary and middle public charter schools. And then a few years ago, I founded Vertex Partnership Academies, which is now, I believe, one of the best high schools in the city. It's an international baccalaureate high school organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. So it's exciting. I'm happy to talk about that, and also how we think about this concept of cultivating agency within a school setting.
Yeah, and I definitely want to go deeper into all of that. My last podcast, which was just a few days ago, was with your AEI colleague, Robert Pondicio.
Oh, a good man.
Who is a good man, education expert. And I was asking him a lot about sort of the effect of radical ideology in schools and, subjects like, agency. And he was very insistent that the bigger problem is competence among school teachers. And we had a spirited conversation about this. I run an organization called the North American Values Institute that focuses on K-12 on a ideological and cultural shift that I believe is producing poor results for kids, that is also distancing themselves from the American dream, and that is depriving them of agency and depriving them of the education tools that they need to succeed in the society. And I'm sure he's right that there's a competency issue as well in schools. But what do you make of that tension, I guess, that he and I were sort of trying to navigate between competence versus ideology or culture, depending on how we want to characterize it?
Well, it's an interesting question. When we were hiring teachers, there were two primary criteria. Uh, First was um, subject matter knowledge. So, to Robert's point, competence, subject matter knowledge, and then pedagogical capacity. Right? Basically, do you know your stuff, and do you have the ability to teach it? And over the last uh, 5 years, 10 years, accelerated since George Floyd, there's been a third leg that we certainly have been looking for when hiring teachers. And that is this ideological alignment of what the role of a teacher is, in the sense of you're not there to be a social justice warrior, you're not there to impose your own political ideology. And we've just seen, especially in places like New York, just a dramatic increase in teachers in some ways wanting to engage in the culture wars in classrooms. So I hear Robert when he's saying subject matter competence, and maybe he's talking competence both in terms of subject matter and pedagogical capacity, because one could argue that's competence for a teacher. But we can't ignore what has happened in terms of the identitarian politics, especially in schools like ours. We're predominantly low income, almost all Black and Hispanic. And there's some teachers that come in and feel this need to, tell these kids how much the world is rigged against them. There are these factors, racism, sexism, all the isms that are so overwhelming that, I mean, even though they wouldn't say these words out loud, but that, they're powerless to overcome them. And that's the essence of agency and fighting that kind of ideology.
I'm going to invoke yet a third AEI fellow, Yuval Levin. Yuval talks a lot about institutions and their institutions sort of exceeding their mandates or sort of not staying in their lanes. They have a purpose. They're set up to do certain things. Those are very important things for society, yet they're all getting so politicized these days. And as a result, they're not serving their core mission. Is that something you see as well?
I mean, you cited yet another brilliant AEI scholar, and he's right. I think he distinguishes between this concept of institutions that mold individuals versus institutions that have become platforms.
Yes. Platforms performance, right.
For performance. Yeah. And unfortunately, that is absolutely true. So you see it in Congress, you see it at almost every level of government where individuals will, for example, during a congressional hearing, will go on a rant for no other purpose than they know that that will become a great soundbite to be posted on the internet, which they can then go raise money. And so, yeah, and the reason that's dangerous, especially in schools, is that if you're a school leader, that means you have kids in your building from, let's say 7:30 a.m. to potentially 4 or 5, because we have longer school days. But you've got kids in your building for, 10, 11, 12 hours a day. Whether you like it or not, you are in the moral formation business. You are shaping character. You are shaping virtue. You are shaping morals. And so if you use that as a platform for your own ideas, as opposed to passing on the wisdom of generations, our school is organized around the four cardinal virtues: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. We didn't make those up. These have a long storied history because they're connected to human flourishing. When institutions start to believe, well, we'll start to promote the ideas of the day, that can become very harmful for kids, especially kids where there are few other sources of that kind of generational wisdom that's so important.
Right. Now, our adversaries are, and the ideologues that are promoting this would say, well, those principles that you've just articulated are actually sources of white supremacy culture and white supremacy. And that what you're really doing is you're passing on your politics and we're challenging your political views with another set of political views, which we feel are going to liberate these students from the structure of white supremacy and systemic racism.
The beauty of our country and the beauty of our founding principles is that we have freedom of speech and we have freedom of thought. So when people express those kinds of ideas, I welcome them in the sense of we should never get to the point where we are doing what is often we quote unquote often accuse the other side of doing, which is just banning ideas or saying you don't have the right to say that. Certainly have the right to say it, but we also have the right and the privilege to defend the generational wisdom. Right? In those instances, we shouldn't get defensive. We should welcome the opportunity to say, why is it that virtues like courage, like temperance, like justice, like wisdom, why have they endured for eons, right? In our school, for example, we have what are called I statements, where every morning our students recite these statements as a way to live out the virtues. So courage is I reject victimhood and boldly persevere, even in times of uncertainty and struggle. Though it's amazing when our kids say that together in unison because they're saying it out loud with each other, and they're basically saying, "Look, we recognize that there are issues in the world, there are challenges, just like any kid, but I reject victimhood. I'm not going to live like that." Right? So when I encounter people who say things like, "Well, that's just white supremacy," okay, you're entitled to your opinion, but there's no basis in what you're saying. And here's my empowering alternative to what you're saying.
Let me ask you a question. It's sort of something that struck me when I was reading your book or when I've thought about your work. You do charter schools in disadvantaged areas. If you were to come to where I live, Montgomery County, Maryland, there are, of course, pockets of social challenge and the like, but it's a relatively affluent area. Would you do charter school education differently, and how so?
Such a good question. I mean, what's interesting is I live in Pelham, New York, which is a lovely community, small community in Westchester, right outside of the Bronx. As the crow flies, it's maybe 4 or 5 miles away from where Vertex is located in the Sound View section of the Bronx. Completely different worlds, completely different economic setting. Here in this Westchester community, most of the families are headed by married parents, lots of home ownership, good schools. And yet, if I were running a school here, absolutely it would be grounded in the four cardinal virtues. The thing that we're witnessing as a society, I think, is that there are well documented issues around kids growing up in low income communities. For sure, there's issues of family structure, there's issues of crime, certainly issues of lack of access to high quality education. But there are issues in upper income, middle class communities too. Maybe they're not impoverished in terms of money, but they could be impoverished in terms of time with family or mental health issues. And so these virtues, and it's something I actually need to think about more in terms of how I even express it. These aren't
Yeah, would they show up the same way in that affluent suburban school as they would in a more disadvantaged urban area?
totally. And what's interesting, especially over the last 5 years, in the absence of these kind of universal human virtues of what really drives human flourishing, a lot of privileged kids started to adopt the same ideas around victimhood in this weird way where because of your quote unquote privilege, if you kind of adopt the characteristics of the so-called marginalized people, then maybe that makes you, I don't know, more acceptable or more chic. It's just interesting what's happening with middle class, upper class kids are adopting ideas around socialism. They're rejecting capitalism. And it's just this weird counter culture against the very things that have allowed them to lead lives of privilege. So in terms of,
That's fascinating.
so I would definitely, I run an international baccalaureate school in the Soundview section of the Bronx. So uh, I would do the same thing if I were in an upper income community.
Okay. Years ago, a lot of years ago, a guy named a social scientist named Philip Kazanitz, who was, I think, a professor at City College of New York, had done some research about immigrant families in New York City. And there were these two competing narratives. One was the sort of the traditional immigrant narrative, like bootstrap narrative, which I know you criticized, rightly so. I understand. But it was the narrative that was empowering these families who came here and very little to get their kids, successful. And then the sort of what I think he called a sort of hip hop culture of the inner city. And in some of these families, it could be a Vietnamese family, you would see both of these influences influencing one child in one way who bought into the sort of bootstrap narrative, and the other child would go in a different direction, influenced by the other narrative. And this would be a very hard thing to aid study or get research funding for today. But it just shows you the power of culture in the molding the way kids succeed or fail. And I think it's very hard to talk about um, without being accused of racism or bigotry or something. But I think it's an important to do so sensitively, because a lot of people who delve into these subjects don't do it sensitively. And I always struggle with it. How can you not talk about parenting, for example, or having two parents in the home, or having fathers who are involved in their kids' lives at the very least, and not see that as a factor, because you see it cuts across racial groups. If you in areas where there are missing fathers in white homes, and it also produces similar social outcomes.
No, I mean, as someone who often talks about um, forces like healthy families, marriage, single parent households, I'm quite familiar with those people who think who think those issues are taboo. And in my view, they're completely misguided. If you're really serious about improving outcomes, particularly kids from, again, it could be wealthy but disadvantaged kids in terms of what their vision is of what they have to succeed in their own lives, and you ignore factors like family structure, you're just not being honest. You're preferring to hold on to a narrative versus actually dealing with hard facts. That's why I run schools. And to your point about children of immigrants, it is interesting when there are studies that look at the results of, let's say children of immigrants who literally came to the country versus the children of those children who've been here for a while. There are differences. There are differences. When you have recent, for example, West African or Caribbean kids coming from the United States, I mean, sorry, from these other countries into the United States, generally, well, a few things. One is generally those families are more intact, right? Generally, those families are married. They usually are faith based. They highly value education. And those three things alone, family, faith, and value of education, those three things alone in many recent immigrant communities translate into dramatic success for kids. But it does start to dissipate as the generations come on. And so as American leaders, we need to think about that. What is it that's happening to kids as they stay in our country and become more, quote unquote, Americanized, that they kind of lose that fire, that drive? And it's something I think we as school leaders have to think about, because I want to replicate that. Part of the reason I believe that things like race shouldn't matter is that when you do look at recent immigrants, Nigerians, certain groups within the Asian community are doing spectacularly well, right? So if they can do that, and I think most people would agree that they're doing it based on a lot of cultural practices, family structure, faith, value of education, then why couldn't those same practices exist within communities that have had more generations in the United States? Right? So that is cultural. That can be taught. We have to have the courage to talk about it and develop the mechanisms by which young people can have the same kinds of experiences that lead them to think that their lives can be their own.
Yeah. You share this anecdote in your book about this argument you had with your parents about what high school to go to, and you wanted to stick with the high school that your parents had a lot of concerns about. And they ended up yielding to you, and you felt very appreciative of them doing that because it allowed you to exercise your own agency and as a result take control of your life. But on the other hand, not everybody's a young Ian Rowe, and I could easily imagine your parents being absolutely right with a different kid. And that was the argument going. I was listening to your book on audio, and I was taking a walk, and I had to hit the pause button on that one because I was thinking, you know what? I think we know that peer culture matters a lot. And we know that, maybe the most important decision you make as a parent is where you live and who your kids are going to hang out with.
Absolutely.
Do you ever think yet, even though it was an example of your parents extending you agency in that situation, because you were this kid who had all the equipment to succeed and make those determinations, a lot of other kids, maybe your parents would have had a good point?
So, David, I will say to you that my parents might have been right. So let me give your listeners the context. So my parents from Jamaica, West Indies, had come to the United States in 1968, a very tumultuous year in race relations for sure in the United States. But we first moved to Brooklyn. And then after a few years in 1973, we moved to Queens, to a small town, Laurelton, Queens, which at the time was predominantly white, Italian, Jewish, Irish, but it was slowly becoming more racially integrated as more Black families moved into the neighborhood. And unfortunately, that led to a series of racial incidents. And my junior high school, 231, became the epicenter for a lot of these unfortunate events or fights, all sorts of things. And the local school board decided to make the way they dealt with this was to create an annex, another junior high school in Rosedale, Queens, so more predominantly, permanently white. And so all of the white parents in my junior high school took their kids out of our school and sent them to this school in Rosedale. And my parents who'd come to this country in search of the American dream, on the assumption that where the white kids go, that's where the better education will be, they wanted to send me there as well. And I'll always remember the Sunday night before the transfer papers needed to go in, that I did something I never thought I would do. I challenged my parents. I said, like, I want to stay at my school. Like, why? Just because? So because basically junior high school 231 was now going to be a virtually all, segregated all Black school, right? And in the annals of most people, all Black must be bad. And I don't know why, but at that moment in my life when I'm 12 years old, I'm begging my parents, please, I want to stay. I want to stay. I'll work hard. Why? Just because if it's all Black, does that mean it has to be bad? I love my teachers. I begged, I cried. And as you said, my parents acquiesced. They did something that I never thought they would do. They let me decide. And that, no question, that was my first, what I call coming of agency moment, where I felt like, if I fought for something, like I could actually influence the outcome.
Love that.
So that's amazing. And yes, I mean, I stayed at the school. I did well. I got into Brooklyn Tech High School, one of the specialized high schools. And so one could say the story played out, right? But, you know, 231 and then the subsequent high school, Springfield, I would have gone to, became one of the most dangerous schools in New York City. It had to be shut down. So, who's right in that situation? My parents, um, they didn't want me to stay at that school because they thought it would become more dangerous, more not provide a good education, and I fought them. Now, I only spent another year or two in that junior high school, so maybe I was able to, be successful. But in this situation, both were right. My parents were right, and I was right to fight to stay. And maybe personally, the reason it worked because I don't like, I'm Ian Rowe, whatever. I mean, I'm no different than any other kid. What I had was a moment that my parents believed in me to make a big decision. That's the lesson, I think. Every kid deserves that moment when on something that they deem important, if they've got the support of their family, I believe in you. Not enough kids have that moment. So they may have been right actually on the technical aspect that this school potentially would not provide a good education, but they made the right decision as it relates to me personally and my belief in agency.
So Coleman Hughes, who I'm sure you know well, and um, a few years ago, and this is when he was really young. He's still a young guy. I probably was 25 years old at the time. Was giving an interview that I thought was fascinating. He was talking about his own upbringing, and he spent time. How he had spent time with an Asian American family and with a Jewish family and their home lives, and how they were different from his own. Now he grew up in a relatively advantaged home life, but he lived in a very diverse area and had friends from different communities and the like. And the Asian American family was sort of this stereotypical tiger mom scenario where the mom was, on her kids to do their homework all the time and practice your piano for 3 hours a day. I happen to be married to a woman from Hong Kong who does live up to that stereotype. Although once we got married and we melded our cultural backgrounds, and Coleman also had spent time with a Jewish family where it was much less strict, but they had a debate culture around the table, which is not unfamiliar to a lot of people who know Jews. We tend to be disputatious people, and I grew up with that. I have Shabbat dinners with up until my kids stopped wanting to have dinner with me, in which I would bring up a topic for debate.
Wow. So great.
And I would say, okay, we're going to tell, and if I say, well, if you have something better, just say it. And then I would always be the devil's advocate. So I would say, well, video games obviously cause violence, and
And did you give them advance warning of the topics or you just introduce it? Right.
then I would be a total jerk devil's advocate and make them debate their point. And I think it helped them develop critical thinking skills.
100%.
But the thing about that, Coleman's point was that he saw these two models up close, about raising parents. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that too. Like, and I feel like that those models sometimes clash, and they even clash in my own mind about how to raise kids. And if one of those models is better for certain types of kids and others are better for other types of kids. And I don't mean by ethnic group or background. I mean by just different kids. Like some kids respond to really strong parenting, telling them what to do, what they need to get done, being insistent on it. And they take that work ethic and they are able to live it out through their lives. And other kids, more like me, I was more of the ADD kid. I think I would have really had a hard time with parent who like made me practice piano 2 hours a day or whatever. My wife made her kid practice 3 hours a day. Actually, she took it to the next level. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that tension between those two different styles and whether each might have their place.
Yeah, it's probably not a satisfactory answer, but I think a parent or a teacher has to use both. There's some times when you are very dictatorial, when you are saying this is what's got to be done, period, and there'll be consequences if you don't. And then there are others that you give more flexibility to stimulate navigation of different ideas. We if you look at most college campuses today, we see there's this kind of widespread phenomena where college students don't have the ability to handle divergent opinion, right? They want to shut things down. These are not, I need a safe space to discuss ideas that are different than my own. And often I say that issue didn't originate in college. I think it originated in high school or even earlier because young people aren't enough in contexts in which they're having to voice their opinion or express their idea or listen to other ideas. I mean, there's all sorts of data surveys happening. I think the Knight Foundation ran a survey, something like 40%, only 40% of high school students felt that it's okay to express an unpopular opinion, or should they should face consequences if they do so. That's dangerous, right? So we need to figure out ways, and we try to do this in our schools, which is what is non-negotiable. Like for us, the virtues are non-negotiable. You have to recite these things every morning. Because we think it's important. We think it's like math. We think that we are passing on generations of wisdom. Like we often talk about AI, artificial intelligence. Well, we focus on AI, ancient intelligence, right? That there is just wisdom that needs to be passed down. So that's non-negotiable. But then we need to engage you in ideas. We're going to be starting hopefully a robust debate program at Vertex. I mean, we had Peter Boghossian came to our school.
Yeah, I know Peter well. Yeah,
yeah, Peter came to our school. We had an amazing day.
Street,
Spectrum Street epistemology.
Yeah,
and we had our students arguing on both sides of the abortion issue, death penalty, down to cell phones. We last year we instituted a policy to no longer allow cell phones in our school. So every morning, cell phones, smartwatches, AirPods get locked in a pouch, not to be seen. And there's some debate about that. But my point being, there are the things that are non-negotiable. This is what we stand for. You're dictatorial about those things. And then there's creating spaces for intellectual freedom. And we have to figure out as educators and as parents to do both.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough balancing act sometimes, and you got to customize to your kids to a degree. It seems to me also challenging to scale in an education system. How do you scale that so you find educators who are able to sort of navigate that?
Well, this is probably the biggest challenge facing public education. I mean, I like to think our school is great, and I'd like to think that there are many other educators that would find such an environment stimulating, and we certainly are attracting a number of those kinds of folks. But Robert Pundischio talks about this all the time. We need millions of teachers, and
like he said something like, was it three? I don't remember what he said. Was it 3.5 million teachers or something like that?
Yeah, no, the numbers are large, and so you'll never get to a situation. I mean, you can have exceptional curriculum, you can have good discipline systems, but you'll never get to a situation where you teacher-proof a school. And so you have to believe that we are attracting, strong leaders and teachers who are values aligned. That's why I said earlier, the three legs. There was pedagogical capacity, subject matter knowledge, and then this kind of ideological alignment around the virtues that really matter. So it's not an easy answer. I think people think that with artificial intelligence, there will be ways to sort of standardize education. Maybe we'll see. There's some promising elements around artificial intelligence as it relates to high impact tutoring, for example.
Yeah, can you imagine having an AI tutor?
Yeah, sure.
who could just adjust to every child and say, okay, this child is this kind of student, this is where their baseline is, and then is able to sort of coach them through education. I mean, I think that sounds fabulously promising, but I was curious to get your take on that, actually.
Well, we just met with the leadership of ChatGPT and OpenAI, and so here's what we are in the midst of developing. So again, we're a virtues-based school. The wisdom of the Stoics. So we are in the early stages of creating these GPTs, which essentially, so instead of a large language model where you've got lots of different input, feeding into an AI tool, we're saying, what if you had a pocket philosopher? So imagine a chat GPT driven solely by the writings of Aristotle, solely, nothing
Mm-hmm.
else,
Mm-hmm.
or Plato,
Mm-hmm.
or Socrates.
That would be amazing.
Well, that's what we're developing.
Oh, awesome.
And so the idea is that when you as a young person encounter an idea, you will have the ability to say, what would Socrates do in this situation? And you will get an answer solely based on all of Socrates' writing. We're so excited by this idea. And hopefully, I mean, it won't just be for Vertex, it's something that could be deployed elsewhere. But that's the kind of thinking that AI will introduce on the good side. So we're excited by it. But to your fundamental point, your fundamental question, how do you replicate this at scale? It's very hard. It's very hard, and I believe that we should be trying to attract amazing people into education. I toyed with the idea a few years ago. Is there kind of a national service idea? And that's what Teach for America became. It's something I think about a lot, which is how to take individual good schools. I mean, in the Bronx, only 7% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. So we've opened up a great high school, but we need a lot more.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think about that too. Like, okay, you talked about how you're able to attract quality teachers because what a great environment it would be to have kids who are, well entrenched in these cardinal virtues and at the same time given latitude for critical thinking. If I were a teacher, that's exactly where I would want to teach. And you could easily be skimming a lot of the greatest teachers who want to work there. And I think about scaling. I went through a phase about 10 years ago where I was really on this sort of progressive education bandwagon. Because I thought I had two kids who were like who were not didn't easily fit the mold, and the school was trying to force them. They were both ADD. One was dyslexic and ADD, and the school was trying to sort of force them into a certain mold and really not teaching to their strengths. I felt, and I became enamored with things like project-based education, which I think has its place, and some other more customized education and less sort of testable education. And yet now I look back and I say maybe I didn't get it entirely right there, because the more I thought about it, the more I wondered, can you really take that and scale it through, with millions of kids in school? You could create a great project-based school in San Diego or wherever that was. Maybe you can create 10 great project based schools, but can you create thousands of them?
Yeah. Well, and this is where, from a policy perspective, so to put, so to move from my individual school leader hat on to a policy, this is where things like school choice really start to matter. Because maybe the answer isn't 1,000 Vertex schools, because maybe we aren't for everyone, that you can get an exceptional education in other school settings. But if we can create an environment where educational entrepreneurs, people who have wonderful ideas, people who care about kids, maybe some may want to run a Montessori school, right? Or some may want to run a STEM focused school. That's where choice, I think, is our best shot to get to the scalability idea. So it isn't necessarily about scaling one model. It's about creating a mechanism by which thousands of amazing leaders can start schools. And as long as there's a mechanism to root out those schools that aren't doing well, I think ultimately that's the best environment to fuel scale of great schools.
I want to wrap it up because I generally keep it to 45 minutes, but I want to ask you one last question. We've gone through a certain ideological moment, maybe it preceded 2021, but it maybe reached its fevered pitch in 2021. I remember it was the summer of 2022. My organization at that time, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, held a gathering of Jewish, Black, and Asian intellectuals in New York. You were there. It was about 60 of us, and it was right after COVID, and we had discussions about how to sort of restore liberalism into our institutions and these values that many of us feel were being eclipsed by that moment. It seems like that's waning in certain ways, but I always make the argument that in certain institutions, particularly K through 12, but maybe higher education and other places, they actually are being sort of institutionalized to a greater degree. As the moment was passing, the people who were trying to get this into the schools were doing double time. I'm wondering if you share that view, and if you where do you think, like, I'm almost asking for strategic advice from you. We're an organization that's doing advocacy. We're not aggressively anti-woke. We're trying to restore civic values into our schools, and to understand that we need freedom of thought and the like, and yet I can't say that the challenge is getting any easier, even as we pass peak woke. What are your feelings on that?
Well, I mean, I think good question. I never actually accept this idea that woke ideology is waning. Again, we live in a free society. People are entitled to their views, and maybe there was, over the last few years, there was a greater focus on identity politics, let's call it, than there is now. But the point is, you always have to be vigilant. You always have to be willing to make the better case for why classical liberal values benefit humans as they have for many generations. And so I last week I had the honor of speaking to some of the best top high school kids in the country, the Calvin Coolidge Senators. And this was in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. And while I had the speech, there was another ceremony, which was a naturalization ceremony. And I'm discovering many people haven't been to these naturalization ceremonies, but there were 24 immigrants from 14 countries. So Congo, Philippines, Iceland, Germany, Jamaica, and here are these people who in the oath of allegiance. If your listeners haven't had a chance to read the oath of allegiance recently, you should. Because Americans born in this country don't need to read it. They never need to take the oath because their citizenship is automatic. But it's well worth listening to what newly minted Americans are committing to: the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, the duties of citizenship, what it means to be an American, what it means to follow these founding principles. And I think we shouldn't let up, whatever evidence there might be that we're kind of in a post-woke period, that never reduces the need for us to be proactive. So it's not being anti-woke, it's being pro liberal values, pro human flourishing, pro cardinal virtues. And I would constantly be aggressive and not not have any kind of, whew, we're past that. Mm-mm.
That's what we did last time. We took these for granted, and when this ideology started encroaching upon our institutions, we didn't have the vocabulary, I think, or many people didn't, to defend these core values. They just sort of let it happen, and before you know it, we had this sort of eruption of liberalism in our institutions. Just we've got to go back to it, to defending those values and insisting on them. I think.
And every generation, I mean, this is, I think, the fundamental essence of conservatism broadly defined. But this idea of every generation is born essentially with a blank slate, more prone to sin, right? And in the absence of actually being taught true virtue, the tendency is to sin
Right,
and
the
do
laws
bad
of
things.
entropy hit into the human, condition, right? Um,
Yeah. So I take your point, but one of the reasons I love your organization is that you're proactively not just being anti woke, but you're pro liberal, classical liberal values, and that's the essence of human flourishing.
I'm gonna just I have to ask you one last thing because I meant to ask it earlier. I've when we had the Great Racial Reckoning, we had, you had ideas like Ibram X. Kendi, how to be an anti-racist, and what was the other one? White fragility, and
Robin DiAngelo, yeah.
yeah, like, and I always thought the right thing to do would be to tee up a John McWhorter or Ian Rowe or Glenn Lowry or somebody who articulates the alternative, and have students look at. I'm not talking about fourth graders. I'm talking about 11th graders or 12th graders. Have students read both and have a discussion. Now, I know one teacher who did this, and in a school that probably and the students who had never heard the counter argument to anti-racism of American Sandy were immediately captivated by its critique and the alternative. And I'm wondering if you've done that in your schools at all. If you've tried to tee up those alternative arguments.
So these are things that are very, very important. And so the answer is yes, and we want to do more. This year, we're introducing Thomas Sowell into our curriculum
Mm-hmm. As you should.
in a much more robust way than we have in the past. I will confess that because of the absence of authors like Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, Jason Riley, Shelby Steele, we've had more of those writings in our curriculum. So, Content of Our Character by Shelby Steele,
Classic.
certainly one of the most influential books I read when I was younger. That's something that our kids read as part of a scholarship competition that they all wrote essays on. And so I will confess that we've had more of a preponderance of the writers that are almost never seen than we do of Ibram Kendi. So I'll
Right.
confess that at the
Maybe you
outset.
you serve a useful counterbalance to what everybody else is being fed every day.
Yes, yes.
Um,
But it is important, as I said before, it is important to create a structured environment where kids do read different ideas, and then in a structured opportunity, let's talk about it. What's the evidence that one philosophy overrides the other? And that is the kind of learned student that we are hoping to produce over time.
Well, that's amazing. Listen, I really want to thank you for your work. I bring on thought leaders and people who have read a lot of books and written a lot of books, and you've done that too, and you are that as well. But also to have a practitioner who's bringing ideas into the real world and seeing what works and then creating models that we all can learn from is just a real privilege for me. And really appreciate the conversation and the ability to talk about these things.
Well, David, you and I are kindred spirits for sure. And no, I really thank you because, there is a time, especially over the last few years, it took real courage and bravery to say the things that we do. What seems like common sense and based on, hundreds of years of conventional wisdom would seem like, of course, these ideas about classical liberal values should win the day, but they haven't, and it has taken real courage to stand up against it. So, thank you for what you do every day, and this is just the beginning for all of us, and I'm very optimistic about the future.
Great to have you on. Thanks a million.
Thanks, David.